This is Pre-Market Prep. I'm Brianna Valesky sitting in for Joel Elconin. I'm joined by Raghee Horner. She is a Forex and currency trading expert for Trade Forex Futures. Raghee, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks, Brianna. I'm stoked to be here.
So, you mentioned just before we got on the show that you do look at equities, but you like Forex because that's where the money is. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I often jokingly say I trade money for money. And when it comes to, you can't dodge the currency markets. Even if you are an equities
Oh,
trader, you're always going
absolutely.
to come back to what the current exchange rate and how the current exchange rate is affecting earnings. And we're going to see a lot of that being cited in earnings probably for the rest of the year.
Hmm.
Where the dollar is at versus some of the weaker currencies abroad, whether that be the euro or the Aussie or the Canadian dollar or the New Zealand dollar. We're going to see a lot of that as part of the discussion. And actually, I think one of the things that's pretty interesting at the moment is where the Dow's at and how that could affect the yen.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, one of the things that I think, I get these phone calls from my equities trading buddies from time to time who watch pairs like the Australian dollar versus Japanese yen or the euro versus Japanese yen, and maybe an equities trader out there saying, well, what does this have to do with me? And my feeling is, if you know what the yen is doing, you probably have a pretty good idea of what's happening in the risk environment. So partly, even as a small part of my life, I do trade equities. I want to know what the Dow is doing because I like trading YM futures. I like trading Dow futures. And then when the Dow is strong, and here's just kind of a rule of thumb for Forex people who may be interested in Forex or the relationship between Forex and equity, when the Dow is strong, look for the yen to be weak. And we're actually bordering on a level that I feel within the context of what the Dow is doing right now could be overbought. I know that may not be very popular in opinion right now, but considering I think there's been a very established range throughout this year, once we start getting north of 18,000 and I'm looking at YM futures, the slope gets pretty darn slippery. And if we start to tumble back down from what I feel is an overbought area between 18,000 and 18,200 for those people looking at the chart, I think we could start to see some yen strength. So a Forex trader then immediately goes to this mindset because we're almost like a matchmaker for a boxing match. You want to pick two fighters that are gonna go up against one another in the ring, and we actually want as uneven a match as possible. We want an absolute tomato can in one corner, and then the strong fighter in the other. And that basically means where can I buy yen against the absolute weakest currency? And New Zealand dollar has been a candidate. That has been the gift that keeps on giving. How and when can I short New Zealand dollar? Their dairy auction, again, hit a brand new 10-year low. They're probably going to either be very dovish or cut rates next week. And then we have the BOC, the Bank of Canada, that just cut rates. So you have these very
Right.
weak stories that the yen could gain against.
So you also mentioned that you were looking at some current US and Canadian data. Can you go a little bit further into that?
Sure. So this morning we had two what I call hot zones. Economic releases for me are essentially timing events. I'm not looking to trade the actual result of the U.S. or the Canadian CPI. I know a lot of people out there are playing, what is the forecast versus the actual. And for what I want to do is definitely step back and say, okay, 8:30 is a time at which there's going to be a lot of intense psychology being applied to the market in a very specific place. In the Canadian dollar for their core CPI, and then in the U.S. dollar for our CPI and building permits and even the housing starts.
Hmm.
So rather than play the game of what's the previous, what's the forecast, and then once I get the actual buy or sell, that to me is it's a much more difficult proposition that relies on lightning fast order execution, not just from my end, but from the whole way down the chain. For me, I want to do what I call catch the wick. I know that there's going to be a volatility event, and I use studies where I can basically look back on history and see just how much a pair like the US dollar, Canadian dollar may move at 8:30 on a Friday. And I'll use that, what I call pip movement range. Like, the average pip movement range, for example, on the US dollar, Canadian dollar for the 8 to 9 o'clock hour is the most volatile of the 24 hours of Forex trading.
Oh, wow.
It could be on average around 50 pips up to 60. So if I know what that pair does on the high end, 50 to 60 pips, I know that at 8:30 we could cover that kind of distance very quickly. And then I look to see where my entries or exits might fall within that range. So it's really, okay, here comes the volatility. Let me quantify it, and then let me see if it means something to me in terms of an entry. So these are things that you can do in equities too. You can do this in futures as well. It's not just a Forex thing that you can apply to the market, just understanding volatility and trying to capitalize on it.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So you already talked a little bit about some of the yen setups that you're looking at. Or is there anything else that's just kind of sticking out to you in the Forex market right now?
Sure. So again, I'm gonna just kind of, for those people listening that are very fluent in Forex, this is probably, it probably sounds pretty familiar, but I guess we have to have at least the obligatory conversation about the euro's effect on the risk environment.
Oh, absolutely.
But I will say, absolutely, right? But it's probably the least interesting story out there, to be quite frank.
Really?
It's taking up a lot of conversation. But when you look at the euro's place against other currencies, and again, it's always a relative performance conversation in Forex. And I think that's probably what bakes most new Forex traders noodles, because they're used to trading an individual story, right? I'm going to buy Apple, or I'm going to buy IBM, or I'm going to sell corn, or I'm going to, sell the S&P, whatever it is. They're used to one story. In Forex, it's always one story against another. So the euro really isn't gaining that steadily against anything, and it's really not losing ground that steadily against anything. And I should mention, I think it also depends on which time frame you're living the market through. If you're a 5-minute trader, your shelf life for a trade is maybe, a couple minutes to a couple hours. Mostly my time frames are dailies.
Oh, okay.
And that allows, so for those who are going, okay, what is she talking about? The euro moved this morning. On a daily chart, it hardly even registered anything. So I think you can absorb a lot of the shock. I call the daily time frame like a shock absorber, because it can absorb a lot of this day-to-day noise and volatility without shaking you loose, unless it's that volatility on a very short time frame that you like to trade. But what I would tell most traders who are either new to Forex or even experienced traders is look for the greatest contracts right now. Right now, it pays to look for, pound buys against currencies like the New Zealand dollar, the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, all three of which probably have the most dovish central banks. We're probably going to get a cut out of the RBNZ. We just got a cut out of the BOC, the Bank of Canada. And there's no reason for the Reserve Bank of Australia to be all that hawkish based on what's happening in China. So those are what I call tomato cans. That's that weak fighter in the ring who's quaking in his boots against a stronger fighter. And for me, that stronger fighter is the pound, the British pound, the US dollar, and even the yen. And I say the yen's going to be kind of a near-term call based upon whether or not we exhaust in the Dow. Again, Dow futures are what I watch, between 18,000 and 18,200. So basically look for ways to sell the Australian dollar, Canadian dollar, and New Zealand dollar, and then look for ways to buy pound, British pound, US dollar, and even yen if we get a little bit of risk off. And that, I think, would keep traders on the right side of the trend.
Hey, absolutely. That's some great advice for any of our traders who are interested in dabbling in Forex. Take a look at what Raghee is suggesting on both sides of that trade. So you mentioned that you also do watch equities. Are there any that you're watching that you think, especially during earnings season, are going to be especially affected by the US dollar or other Forex headwinds?
Right now, in terms of what I want to do on a general basis, my scan usually begins with weekly time frames on equity.
Okay.
And I take a much longer term approach. So while there are certainly individual stock names that are on my watch list, the watch list is going to begin, and this is probably another good tip for new traders. My watch list is going to begin with those symbols that are trending. So,
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to some of your earlier guests talk about, the names I think that are on a lot of our interest, our watch list. Names like Apple, names like Netflix. Apple actually. This is a probably really good recent example. Apple just pulled back into what I would consider a weekly correction, and I had a pending order waiting in the 120, 150 area based upon a weekly correction and the previous lows that we'd seen in Apple back in mid-March, I think it was. And so it's those type of weekly, longer-term corrections that I like to play into earnings season, whether that be buying calls into pullbacks. So I really, part of being a trend trader, and I was just having this discussion with a friend of mine yesterday who just asked, and a non-trading friend said, what is a trend? We had this big discussion on what it is to identify a trend in a consistent manner and then take advantage of corrections. Because if you know there's a trend, a move lower isn't immediately a reversal. It's really a retracement. And then, my mantra is, how do I get opportunistic on that retracement? How do I get opportunistic when everyone else is panicking? Where's the opportunity in the case of, say, Apple to buy? It's really hard to find positive news on a story that's pulling back from, where were we? Up near 132, 133. It's hard to find positive stories when the market's knocking on the door of 120. But if there's an overall uptrend, that to me is being opportunistic. So you look at names like Apple or Amazon. I think I was looking at Netflix earlier. A nice uptrend in Amazon, but I'm not actually interested in Amazon till about 405, maybe 410.
Okay.
And it's up at 480 right now. So a lot of people are saying, "Whoa, you're waiting a long time." Yeah, I'm going to end up waiting I'm going to wait a long time on that weekly, sure. But then I could also engage the daily at, say, 440 or 450 if we get a correction. So a lot of traders, I think, succumb to the pig in the head, and they'll buy it. Where are we now? 479, 480?
Yeah.
And it obviously depends on your strategy. I mean, I think some options traders could have, a different kind of strategy on how they could position themselves long at heights like this. But for me, where I'm just looking to flat out buy the stock, what I want to remember is that on a pullback, I have to trust that trends pull back. So on a pullback, I can't hesitate. I want to realize the difference between a reversal versus a correction, and then buy into something like a 450 or a 440 pullback, and not rely on buying up here at 479 or 480. I mean, that brings us to the greater fool theory, right? The only way my 479 buy works is if someone thinks 481 is realistic. If someone, so I don't want to rely on the greater fool behind me. So these kind of days should really be a follow-through day, is the way I look at the market. It should be an opportunity just to take advantage of the hard work that you did in June or early July, and this is followed through. I don't believe these are actionable days up here, unless you're a day trader. And again, you're living your life through the time frame that you've chosen, and as long as you stay true to that, I think you're going to miss out on a whole world of hurt. Stay true to those time frames.
Raghee, we've only got a minute left with you. We have one of our listeners in the chat. I know you were just talking about the pound, but they might have missed that really quick. If you could really quick just reiterate, do you have any strong views on the pound right now?
Buy it on a pullback.
All right. I like that conviction.
Buy it on a pullback, and preferably against stories like the New Zealand dollar, the Canadian dollar, or the Australian dollar. And I'm going to say something really unpopular, but I'm saying it because I sincerely do not want people to get steamrolled by this market. Unless you are a U.S. dollar bear, do not engage the cable. Don't make the Forex 101 mistake of simply trading stories against the U.S. dollar. We have the flexibility to find better matchups, and the pound U.S. is not a great matchup. So my advice is wait for a pullback, and we have next week the RBNZ. So there'll be some volatility on that Reserve Bank of New Zealand. My favorite right now is pound versus New Zealand.
We've been on the line with Raghee Horner. She is a Forex and currency trading expert at Trade Forex Futures. Raghee, thank you so much for joining us on the show today and helping give our traders and investors a little bit of a look at the Forex markets.
No, I appreciate it, Beyond. Thanks so much for the time, and I look forward to the next time we get to chat about the markets.
Absolutely.